Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about major scale chord progressions. First off, download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. It contains everything that I'm talking about in this lesson, all the charts and diagrams, as well as much more, so it'll be really useful to you. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download that. But I am working on it right now as I'm filming this lesson, so it may not be available as you're watching this lesson. And if it's not available yet, it'll say coming soon. And if you'd like to get notified when it is available, you can sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a notification for when it is available and let you download it. And also, if you're signed up for our mailing list, you'll receive all updated versions as well. But don't worry, you don't need the e-guide to follow along with this lesson because all the charts and diagrams will be on the screen. And also, we add at least one new lesson every day, so be sure to subscribe. This is part 2.12 from our series Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So in the previous lesson, I talked about the harmonized major scale. And we looked at this chart and we saw that if you build a chord starting on the 1 of any major scale, you get a major triad. If you build it off the 2, the second note of that major scale, you get a minor. Build it off the 3rd note, you get a minor. 4th note, major. 5th, major. 6th, minor. 7th, diminished. So if I looked at any one of these major scales, if I started on A or just any of them, if I was to turn this major scale into chords, into triad chords, I would get an A major, B minor, C sharp minor, D major, E major, F sharp minor, G sharp diminished, and then we're back at the A major to start over. Be the same if I did it with B flat, it'd be B flat major, C minor, D minor, E flat major, F major, G minor, A diminished. And that was the harmonized major scale with triads, meaning that instead of looking at the major scale with just single notes, we weren't just looking at these as single notes anymore. We were building triads off every note. And a triad is a chord which is harmony, because harmony is 2 or more notes being played or sung at the same time. So that was why it was called the harmonized major scale. You also hear chord scale as well. And up here represented the numbers of each note of the scale. So 1 for, if we were looking in the key of A, 1 would be for A, 2 for B, and so on. And something I didn't mention, what you'll hear when you get into what we're talking about in this lesson, which is chord progressions, you'll hear the 1 chord, the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 4 chord, and so on. So those numbers represent the harmonized major scale as well. And I'll talk more about that as we go through this lesson. And what we're going to do in this lesson is talk about chord progressions that come out of the major scale. And a chord progression is just a series of chords played in some sort of sequence. So pretty much all songs, or most songs, have chord progressions in them. That's what the song is made up of. Just taking chords, putting them into some sort of sequence, and then repeating them, and then you might have different sections where you have different chord progressions. But in the most basic sense, you could take 2 chords, put them together, you have a chord progression, but you could have a whole bunch of chords put together in a chord progression as well. And what we're talking about in this lesson are diatonic to the major scale, which just means all these chord progressions are going to come out of the major scale, but also diatonic to 1 key. So if we look at the key of C, we'll be talking about a chord progression that comes straight out of the key of C and not from more than 1 key. And the majority of songs, when you listen to popular music, come from 1 key, but they don't have to. Some songs change keys, some songs borrow a chord from another key, and we'll get into that in later lessons. This lesson will just be looking at 1 key at a time. And so if you look at this on the screen now, you should be able to recognize that that's a C major scale. It's just C to C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and back to C. And you should know by now that C has no sharps or flats, so that's why there's no sharps or flats in it. This is the actual scale if we were looking at these as notes. If we were looking at these as triads and turning this into a harmonized major scale, it would look like this. 1 chord would be C major, 2 chord would be D minor, 3 chord would be E minor, 4 would be F major, 5 G major, 6 A minor, 7 B diminished, and then we're back to C. And in case you don't know, anytime you see a chord by itself, that represents major. If it's minor or something else, it's going to say something after the letter name. But if you just were to see something like a C by itself when you're looking at chords, that represents major. I'm sure you probably know that at this point, but just in case someone doesn't. So if we were to build a chord progression in the key of C, we could take any of these chords, put them into some sort of order, and repeat it. We'd have a chord progression. And there's certain chords that go together that sound better to our ears because we've heard them so much in popular music. So that's what's known as popular chord progressions, and tons of songs that you listen to use these chord progressions. So I'm going to talk about a few popular chord progressions, but if you want to learn more, I have a whole series on popular chord progressions for beginners, so you can check that out. So an example of a popular chord progression would be to take the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord, put them together, play them in order, and just repeat. And you'd end up with a 1, 4, 5 chord progression in the key of C. So again, the Roman numerals are representing the chord in that scale. So 1 was for the chord built off the first note of the scale, 4 is for the chord built off the 4th note, and so on. And you'll hear that often. You'll hear something like play a 1, 4, 5 in the key of C, or play a 1, 4, 5 in the key of G. That would tell you, if you have the theory knowledge, what chords to play, because in the key of C, a 1 chord is always a C major, a 4 chord is always an F major, and a 5 chord is always a G major, or some sort of variation of a major chord, which we'll get into that in later lessons. So that would be a popular chord progression from the key of C. Or we could look at the key of G, which we'd end up with G, A minor, B minor, C, D, E minor, F sharp diminished. If we played a 1, 4, 5 from the key of G, we'd have a G, C, D, and it would look like this. It'd be a 1, 4, 5 in the key of G. Another example of a popular chord progression, if we go back to the key of C, is a 1, 6, 2, 5. So that's C, A minor, D minor, G. So put those into the order I just said, and you would end up with C, A minor, D minor, G, or 1, 6, 2, 5 in the key of C. Or if we were going to do that in the key of G, you would end up with G, E minor, A minor, D. So that's a 1, 6, 2, 5 in the key of G. So by knowing what these Roman numerals represent, and knowing each of the chords in the major scale, in the harmonized major scale, all you have to hear once you have that knowledge is the number and the key, and you'd be able to know what chord you were going to play. And that's not something you need to memorize right now. You have that chart that I gave you that would be really easy to look up. So if we went back to this chart, if we wanted to look at a 1, 4, 5 in the key of C, well, here's 1, here's 4, here's 5. We know that 1's major, 4 is major, 5's major. We just look down to the key of C. The 1 is C, the 4 is F, the 5 is G. We know that it's a C major, F major, G major. That's how you could use this chart until you have that memorized. So one more really popular chord progression, and it's one of the most popular chord progressions in popular music, is what's known as a 1, 5, 6, 4. So in the key of C, a 1 would be C, obviously, 5 would be G, 6 would be A, 4 would be F. So if you had a 1, 5, 6, 4 in the key of C, you'd have a C major, G major, A minor, F major. That's a really popular chord progression that you'll find in tons of songs. And if you watch a video done by Axis of Awesome called the 4 Chord Song, you can see a demonstration of this where they've taken this chord progression, and I believe they played in the key of E, but it's the same concept, it's the same chord progression, and showed how many songs use that progression, and it's just a ton. And then if we looked at it in the key of G, you would end up with G, D, E minor, C. That'd be a 1, 5, 6, 4 in the key of G. So that's the basic theory behind chord progressions. And if you've never done it before, just start in the key of G or C because they're the easiest keys to play on the guitar. Take chords and put them into some sort of order in one of those keys and just find different combinations that you like, and then you've written your own song. The most common thing to do is to start with the 1 chord. For example, if you're in the key of G, to start with the 1 chord, and then it would end on the one chord to make it sound like it was finished. But you don't have to do that. It doesn't have to start on the one chord. It's just a very common thing to do and will sound good to your ears because we're used to hearing that a lot. But in upcoming lessons, I'll show you that it doesn't necessarily have to be the one chord that you start with. So hopefully that opened your eyes up to understanding chord progressions from the major scale and playing diatonic chord progressions in one key. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to reverse engineer this. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a sequence of chords and show you how to find what key they're in. And that's an extremely useful thing that you need to know as a guitarist, because you need to be able to see a sequence of chords and figure out their key. But I'll explain that in the next lesson. So go ahead and move on to the next lesson, and be sure to download the e-guide so you can have all of this as a reference, all these diagrams, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.